Picture this. It's July 15th, 1941, and you're a German Afrika Korps soldier advancing through the scorching heat of the Libyan desert toward the fortress city of Tobruk, confident that this isolated Allied garrison will fall within days, like every other position you've encountered during Rommel's lightning advance across North Africa. Your panzer divisions have swept across hundreds of miles of desert, crushing British resistance, and earning the Desert Fox his legendary reputation as an unstoppable force that has reversed months of Allied gains in just weeks. The sun beats down mercilessly as your unit approaches the outer defenses of Tobruk, and you can see the port city shimmering in the distance like a mirage. Intelligence reports suggest that the defenders are demoralized, cut off from supply, and ready to surrender at the first serious German assault. Your officers have told you that Tobruk will fall within 48 hours, clearing the way for the final advance into Egypt and the capture of the Suez Canal that will split the British Empire in half. Suddenly, from the rocky escarpments surrounding the port, you hear something that makes you question your sanity and everything you thought you knew about warfare. Rising above the thunder of artillery and the rattle of machine gun fire is the sound of men shouting, laughing, and what can only be described as organized chaos. You peer through your binoculars and see something that defies all military logic and conventional understanding of how soldiers should behave under siege conditions. Australian soldiers are playing some kind of violent ball game in the middle of a battlefield, tackling each other with bone-crushing force while German shells explode around them. They're running, jumping, and colliding with each other with such ferocity that it looks more like a riot than a game. Yet there's clearly method to their madness. These men aren't cowering in their trenches or preparing for surrender. They're engaged in what appears to be ritualized combat that seems to energize them rather than exhaust them. What you're witnessing isn't madness or the breakdown of military discipline. It's the rats of Tobruk, Australian soldiers who turned their national sport of Australian rules football into the most unconventional and effective combat training program of World War II. These men didn't just defend Tobruk for 241 days against impossible odds. They used the brutal physicality and tactical complexity of Aussie rules to forge themselves into one of the most effective fighting forces in military history, proving that sometimes the best preparation for war comes from the most unexpected sources. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, whether you're a footy fan in Melbourne, a military history enthusiast in Berlin, a desert warfare student in Cairo, or discovering this incredible story from somewhere completely unexpected. I love connecting with our global community of history enthusiasts. The story you're about to hear will completely revolutionize everything you think you know about military training, the psychology of warfare, and the incredible ingenuity of soldiers fighting for their lives in impossible circumstances. Today we're going to reveal how Australian soldiers transformed a children's game into a weapon of war, how the brutal tactics of football became the foundation for desert combat supremacy, and how the spirit of Australian rules football helped save the Middle East from Nazi conquest and change the entire course of the North African campaign. To understand how Australian rules football became a secret weapon in the siege of Tobruk, we need to go back to early 1941, when the strategic situation in North Africa appeared hopeless for the Allied cause, and the entire Middle East seemed destined to fall under Nazi control. German General Erwin Rommel had arrived in Libya with his Afrika Korps in February 1941 and immediately launched a series of lightning attacks that shattered British defenses and sent Allied forces reeling back across hundreds of miles of desert in what became known as one of the most spectacular military reversals of World War II. The British had been advancing steadily across North Africa since late 1940, defeating Italian forces with what seemed like ease and capturing vast territories, including most of Libya. Operation Compass had been a stunning success that saw British and Commonwealth forces advance over 500 miles in 2 months, capturing 130 Hohenzollern Italian prisoners and destroying entire Italian armies. The campaign had been so successful that many British commanders believed the North African theatre was essentially won and began transferring their best troops to other fronts. But Rommel's arrival changed everything overnight in ways that no one had anticipated. The Desert Fox, as he would become known to both friend and foe, brought with him not just experienced German troops and modern equipment, but a completely new approach to desert warfare that combined speed, aggression, and tactical innovation in ways that caught the British completely off guard and unprepared for the onslaught that was about to engulf them. Within weeks of his arrival, Rommel had reversed months of British gains, recaptured most of Libya, and was threatening to drive the Allies completely out of North Africa and into Egypt. His tactics were revolutionary for desert warfare. He used his tanks and motorized infantry in coordinated attacks that moved faster than British forces could respond, striking at weak points in Allied lines and exploiting breakthroughs with a speed and aggression that overwhelmed traditional defensive thinking. The strategic implications of Rommel's success were enormous and terrifying for the Allied cause. If Rommel succeeded in capturing Egypt, he would control the Suez Canal, cutting Britain's lifeline to India and the Far East and potentially strangling the British Empire's ability to continue fighting. Even more dangerous, a German victory in Egypt could potentially link up with German forces advancing through the Caucasus from the Russian front, creating a massive German empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. In this desperate situation, the port city of Tobruk became a crucial strategic prize that neither side could afford to lose. For the Germans, Tobruk represented the key to further advance into Egypt. Its deep water harbor was essential for supplying any German offensive toward the Suez Canal, as the limited road and rail infrastructure in the desert made seaborne supply absolutely crucial for maintaining large military forces in the region. For the Allies, Tobruk was the last major stronghold in Libya, a fortress that could tie down German forces and prevent Rommel from concentrating his entire army for the final push into Egypt. If Tobruk could hold out, it would force the Germans to maintain a significant siege force, while also defending their supply lines against attacks from the garrison, potentially buying time for British forces to regroup and launch a counter-offensive. The problem was that Tobruk appeared to be completely indefensible by any conventional military analysis. The city was surrounded by hundreds of miles of desert, controlled by German forces, cut off from any possibility of land-based reinforcement or supply. The harbor was under constant attack from German aircraft and artillery, making seaborne supply extremely dangerous and unreliable. The defensive positions around the city were outdated, designed for a different kind of warfare, and manned by troops who had been retreating for weeks and whose morale was at rock bottom. The defensive perimeter around Tobruk stretched for over 30 miles through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The positions had been built by the Italians and were not designed to withstand the kind of modern mechanized assault that Rommel was preparing to launch. The fortifications were incomplete, poorly sited, and lacked the depth and complexity needed to stop determined German attacks supported by tanks and aircraft. Into this seemingly hopeless situation came the 9th Australian Division, commanded by Major General Leslie Morshead, a tough, no-nonsense officer who had earned his reputation as a disciplinarian and tactical innovator during World War I. Morshead understood that defending Tobruk would require more than just good positions and adequate supplies. It would require soldiers who could maintain their fighting spirit and tactical effectiveness under conditions that would break most military units. Morshead was a unique commander who combined traditional military professionalism with an understanding of the Australian character and culture that would prove crucial to the success of the Tobruk defence. He recognised that Australian soldiers were different from British troops and that their effectiveness depended on maintaining their cultural identity and the informal, democratic leadership style that was characteristic of Australian military units. The Australians who arrived in Tobruk were a unique breed of soldier, men who had grown up in one of the world's harshest environments and who possessed a cultural background that would prove perfectly suited to the challenges they were about to face. These were men from the Australian outback, from mining towns and cattle stations, from cities where life was hard and competition was fierce. They had been shaped by a culture that valued toughness, independence, and the ability to improvise solutions to impossible problems. Most importantly, these men had grown up playing Australian rules football, a sport that was unlike anything else in the world, and that had shaped their understanding of teamwork, physical courage, and tactical thinking in ways that would prove invaluable in combat. Aussie rules, as it was known throughout Australia, was a game of extraordinary violence and complexity, combining elements of rugby, soccer, and pure mayhem into a sport that demanded not just physical toughness, but tactical intelligence, split-second decision-making, and the ability to function effectively as part of a team under extreme pressure. Australian rules. Football was more than just a game in Australian culture. It was a way of life that taught fundamental lessons about courage, teamwork, and the ability to overcome seemingly impossible odds through determination and tactical innovation. The sport demanded that players be able to think quickly under pressure, adapt to rapidly changing situations, and maintain their effectiveness even when exhausted, injured, or facing overwhelming opposition. The physical demands of Aussie rules were extraordinary, and unlike any other sport in the world. Players had to run for miles during a single game while engaging in brutal physical contact that would be considered assault in most other contexts. The game was played on a field that was larger than any other sport, requiring exceptional endurance and the ability to maintain tactical awareness over vast distances while dealing with constant physical confrontation. Players had to be able to catch balls while being tackled by multiple opponents, make split-second decisions about when to pass and when to run, and maintain their tactical awareness even while being pounded by opponents who were trying to separate them from both the ball and their consciousness. The sport rewarded players who could think clearly under pressure and who could maintain their effectiveness even when facing overwhelming odds. But perhaps most importantly, Aussie rules taught players to embrace controlled aggression as a tactical tool rather than an emotional response. The sport rewarded players who could channel their natural fighting instincts into precise, effective actions that achieved specific tactical objectives. Players learned to be aggressive without being reckless, to take calculated risks that could change the course of a game, and to maintain their composure even in the most chaotic and violent situations. The tactical complexity of Australian rules football was extraordinary and required players to understand and execute complex strategies that involved coordinated movement of multiple players across a large field. The sport demanded constant communication, rapid adaptation to changing circumstances, and the ability to read and respond to the tactical intentions of opponents who were trying to outmaneuver and outthink them. When the Australians arrived in Tobruk and began assessing their defensive positions, they quickly realized that conventional military training would be inadequate for the challenges they were about to face. The siege warfare they were preparing for would require soldiers who could function effectively in small groups, make independent tactical decisions, and maintain their fighting effectiveness even when cut off from higher command and facing overwhelming odds. The desert environment itself presented challenges that were unlike anything most soldiers had ever encountered. Temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, while nights could be surprisingly cold. Water was scarce and had to be carefully rationed, while the constant sand and dust made equipment maintenance a constant challenge. The terrain offered little natural cover, making movement dangerous and requiring soldiers to create their own concealment and defensive positions. Major General Morshead, recognizing the unique qualities that Australian rules football had instilled in his men, made a decision that seemed insane to conventional military thinking, but that would prove to be one of the most innovative leadership decisions of World War II. He encouraged his troops to continue playing football even while under siege, and he began incorporating football tactics and training methods into their combat preparation. What started as a way to maintain morale quickly evolved into the most innovative and effective combat training program of World War II. Morshead understood that the skills and attitudes developed through football were directly applicable to the kind of warfare his men would face in the desert, and he was determined to use every advantage available to maximize their effectiveness and survival. The football games that began in Tobruk were unlike anything that had been seen before in military history. These weren't recreational activities designed to pass time during quiet periods. They were intense, violent training exercises that prepared soldiers for the brutal realities of close-quarters combat in desert conditions. The games were played with a ferocity that shocked even experienced military observers, with soldiers tackling each other with bone-crushing force while German shells exploded around them. The game served multiple purposes that went far beyond simple recreation. They maintained physical fitness in conditions where traditional exercise was difficult or impossible. They provided crucial mental relief from the constant stress of combat and siege conditions. Most importantly, they reinforced the tactical skills and team dynamics that would be essential for survival and effectiveness in combat operations. The tactical lessons of Australian rules football proved to be perfectly applicable to desert warfare in ways that no one had anticipated. The sport's emphasis on rapid movement, quick decision-making, and the ability to function effectively in small groups translated directly to the kind of patrol and raiding tactics that would become the Australians' signature in the desert. Players who had learned to read the flow of a football game and anticipate their opponent's moves found that they could apply the same skills to predicting German tactical movements and positioning themselves for maximum effectiveness. The concept of playing the percentages that was central to successful football strategy became a cornerstone of Australian tactical thinking in the desert. Just as football teams learned to take calculated risks that offered the best chance of success, Australian soldiers learned to assess tactical situations quickly and choose courses of action that maximize their chances of success while minimizing unnecessary risks. The physical conditioning that came from playing Aussie rules was ideal preparation for desert warfare and provided advantages that conventional military training could not match. The sport's demands for endurance, strength, and the ability to function effectively while exhausted proved invaluable for soldiers who would have to fight in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit while carrying heavy equipment across difficult terrain. The brutal physical contact of the sport prepared soldiers for the shock and violence of close-quarters combat in ways that conventional training could never match. Perhaps most importantly, the team dynamics of Australian rules football created unit cohesion that was essential for effective combat performance and survival under siege conditions. Players who had learned to trust their teammates absolutely, to sacrifice individual glory for team success, and to support each other through the most difficult moments of a game, found that these same qualities made them extraordinarily effective soldiers who could be relied upon to fight to the death for their comrades. The psychological benefits of continuing to play football during the siege were enormous and far-reaching, affecting not just individual soldiers, but the entire garrison. The games provided crucial mental relief from the constant stress of combat, giving soldiers something to look forward to and a way to maintain their connection to home and normal life. But more than that, the games reinforced the soldiers' sense of identity and cultural pride, reminding them that they were not just anonymous military units, but proud Australians fighting for their nation and their way of life. The football games also served as a form of psychological warfare against the Germans, who could hear the sounds of organized recreation coming from the Australian positions and couldn't understand how soldiers under siege could maintain such high morale. German intelligence reports from the period express bewilderment at the Australians' apparent indifference to their desperate situation and their ability to maintain fighting effectiveness despite being cut off and outnumbered. German officers monitoring Australian positions reported hearing laughter, cheering, and what appeared to be organized sporting events coming from areas that should have been filled with demoralized, desperate soldiers preparing for surrender. This intelligence was so contrary to German expectations that many commanders initially dismissed it as misinformation or propaganda, unable to believe that soldiers under siege could maintain such high spirits. As the siege progressed, the Australians began to develop specific tactical innovations that were directly inspired by football strategies and that would revolutionize small unit tactics in desert warfare. They created small, highly mobile units that operated like football teams, with each member having specific roles and responsibilities, but also the flexibility to adapt to changing situations. These units could move quickly across the desert, strike at German positions with devastating effectiveness, and disappear before the enemy could respond. The Australians' use of deception and misdirection, tactics that were fundamental to successful football play, proved highly effective against German forces, who had been trained to expect more conventional military behavior. Australian patrols would use feints and false movements to confuse German defenders, creating opportunities for devastating attacks that caught the enemy completely off guard. The improvisational skills that were essential for successful football play proved invaluable in combat situations where plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. Soldiers who had learned to adapt quickly to changing situations on the football field found that they could apply the same flexibility to military operations, developing creative solutions to tactical problems that conventional training had never addressed. The physical training methods developed around football proved to be ideal preparation for desert combat and superior to conventional military fitness programs. The sport's emphasis on functional fitness, strength, endurance, and agility that could be applied directly to real-world situations created soldiers who were better prepared for the physical demands of warfare than troops who had received only conventional military training. The Australians developed training exercises that combined football drills with military skills, creating hybrid activities that prepared soldiers for combat while maintaining the competitive spirit and camaraderie that made the training effective. Soldiers would practice weapon handling while running football drills, learn tactical movement while playing modified versions of the game, and develop teamwork skills through activities that combined athletic and military challenges. These hybrid training exercises were remarkably innovative and effective. Soldiers would practice grenade throwing using football passing techniques, learning to deliver explosives with the same accuracy and timing they used to pass a football to a teammate. They would practice small unit movement using football formations, learning to coordinate their actions and maintain tactical awareness while moving across open terrain. The leadership lessons of football proved equally valuable in combat situations and created a unique command structure that was both effective and democratic. Players who had served as team captains and had learned to motivate their teammates under pressure found that these same skills made them effective military leaders who could inspire their men to extraordinary achievements. The democratic leadership style that was common in Australian football, where leadership was based on respect and competence rather than formal rank, created military units with exceptional morale and effectiveness. The tactical complexity of Australian rules football, with its intricate patterns of movement and coordination, provided an excellent foundation for understanding military tactics and strategy. Soldiers who had learned to read the complex tactical situations that developed during football games found that they could apply the same analytical skills to military situations, anticipating enemy movements and developing countermeasures with remarkable effectiveness. The communication skills developed through football proved essential for effective military operations in the desert environment. Players who had learned to communicate effectively in the noise and chaos of a football game found that they could maintain communication and coordination even in the most difficult combat situations. The hand signals, verbal codes, and intuitive understanding that developed between teammates translated directly to military operations. As the siege of Tobruk continued through the brutal summer of 1941, the effectiveness of the Australian football-based training program became increasingly apparent to both Allied and German commanders. Australian units consistently outperformed other Allied forces in patrol actions, raids, and defensive operations. Their casualty rates were lower than those of comparable units, while their success rates in offensive operations were significantly higher. The Germans began to develop a grudging respect for the Australian defenders that was reflected in their intelligence reports and tactical assessments. German officers noted that Australian positions were more difficult to attack than those held by other Allied forces, that Australian patrols were more aggressive and effective, and that Australian soldiers seemed to possess a level of tactical innovation and fighting spirit that was difficult to counter. German tactical reports from the period describe encounters with Australian units that fought with unusual tenacity and tactical sophistication. German commanders noted that Australian soldiers seemed to anticipate German tactical moves and respond with countermeasures that suggested superior tactical training and unit cohesion. The reports express frustration with the Australians' ability to maintain effective resistance, despite being outnumbered and cut off from supply. The psychological impact of the Australians' football-based culture extended beyond their own units to influence the morale of other Allied forces in the theatre. British, Indian, and South African troops who served alongside the Australians were inspired by their example and began to adopt some of their training methods and tactical approaches. The Australian model demonstrated that unconventional approaches to military training could produce superior results. The football games themselves became legendary throughout the Allied forces in North Africa, with soldiers from other units travelling considerable distances to watch the Australians play. These games served as morale boosters for the entire Allied force and became symbols of the determination and fighting spirit that would eventually lead to victory in the Desert Campaign. The games attracted attention from war correspondents and military observers, who were amazed by the spectacle of soldiers playing violent sports while under siege. Reports of the football games appeared in newspapers around the world, creating a powerful propaganda image of Australian resilience and determination that helped maintain home-front morale during the darkest days of the war. The tactical innovations developed by the Australians during the siege of Tobruk began to influence Allied military thinking throughout the theatre and beyond. Military observers studied Australian methods and began incorporating football-based training techniques into their own programs. The success of the Australian approach led to broader recognition of the value of sports-based military training and the importance of maintaining cultural identity and morale during extended combat operations. British and American military analysts began studying the Australian model and incorporating elements of sports-based training into their own programs. The success of the Tobruk defense led to increased interest in unconventional training methods and the recognition that traditional military training might not be adequate for all combat situations. The intelligence value of the Australian football program was significant and often overlooked by conventional military analysis. The games provided excellent cover for intelligence-gathering activities, as German observers who monitored Australian positions would focus on the apparently recreational activities rather than looking for signs of military preparation. Australian intelligence officers could conduct briefings and planning sessions during football games without arousing German suspicion. The games also provided opportunities for psychological operations against German forces. The sounds of organized recreation and high morale coming from Australian positions created doubt among German soldiers about the effectiveness of the siege and the likelihood of Australian surrender. This psychological pressure contributed to declining German morale and effectiveness. The medical benefits of the football program were substantial and contributed significantly to the overall effectiveness of Australian forces during the siege. The physical conditioning provided by regular football play reduced injury rates and improved recovery times for soldiers who were wounded in combat. The cardiovascular fitness developed through the sport helped soldiers cope with the extreme heat and physical demands of desert warfare. The mental health benefits of maintaining recreational activities helped reduce the incidence of combat fatigue and other psychological problems that plagued military units during extended combat operations. Soldiers who participated in regular football games showed lower rates of depression, anxiety, and other stress-related disorders that could impair military effectiveness. The logistical challenges of maintaining a football program during a siege were considerable but manageable with Australian ingenuity and determination. Australian quartermasters had to ensure adequate supplies of footballs, which were regularly destroyed by shrapnel or lost during games played near the front lines. The balls became valuable commodities that were carefully maintained and repaired whenever possible, with soldiers developing remarkable ingenuity in keeping their equipment functional under impossible conditions. Soldiers learned to repair footballs using materials salvaged from military equipment, creating hybrid balls that might not have met official specifications, but that served their purpose. They developed techniques for playing modified versions of the game that required less equipment and could be adapted to the limited space and resources available during siege conditions. The cultural significance of the football program extended far beyond its military applications to become a symbol of Australian national identity and resilience that resonated throughout the British Empire and beyond. News reports about the Rats of Tobruk playing football while under siege captured the imagination of the Australian public and became powerful propaganda tools that helped maintain home front morale during the darkest days of the war. The image of Australian soldiers maintaining their cultural traditions and fighting spirit while under siege became a powerful symbol of resistance against Nazi tyranny. The story was featured in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels around the world, creating an international reputation for Australian military effectiveness and cultural resilience. The international recognition of the Australian football program helped establish Australia's reputation as a significant military power and contributed to the country's growing influence in Allied strategic planning. The success of Australian forces in North Africa, attributed in part to their innovative training methods, led to increased Australian participation in major Allied operations throughout the war. The program also demonstrated the value of maintaining cultural identity and traditions during military service, leading to changes in military policy that recognized the importance of cultural factors in military effectiveness. This recognition influenced the development of military units that maintained strong cultural identities while serving in integrated Allied forces. The long-term impact of the Tobruk football program on Australian military culture was profound and lasting, influencing military training and doctrine for decades after the war. The lessons learned during the siege influenced Australian military training for generations, with sports-based training becoming a standard component of Australian military preparation. The program demonstrated the value of maintaining cultural identity and traditions even under the most extreme circumstances. The tactical innovations developed during the siege of Tobruk were studied and adopted by military forces around the world, contributing to the development of modern small unit tactics and special forces doctrine. The Australian model of aggressive patrolling, small unit operations, and the use of sports-based training influenced military thinking in numerous countries and became part of the foundation for modern special operations forces. The psychological principles demonstrated by the Australian football program, the importance of maintaining morale, cultural identity, and team cohesion during extended combat operations, became fundamental elements of military psychology and were incorporated into training programs for elite military units worldwide. The scientific study of the Australian football program led to important advances in understanding the relationship between physical fitness, mental toughness, and combat effectiveness. Researchers found that soldiers who participated in competitive sports showed superior performance in numerous military tasks and were better able to cope with the stresses of combat operations. The leadership development aspects of the football program proved to have lasting value beyond the immediate military context. Many of the soldiers who served as team captains and leaders during the siege went on to successful military and civilian careers, applying the leadership skills they had developed through sports to a wide range of challenging situations. The medical research conducted on Australian soldiers during and after the siege provided valuable insights into the relationship between physical conditioning, nutrition, and combat performance under extreme conditions. The findings influenced military medical practice and contributed to improved health and fitness standards for military personnel worldwide. The siege of Tobruk finally ended in December 1941, when British forces launched Operation Crusader and relieved the Australian garrison after 241 days of continuous combat. The Australians had not only held their positions against overwhelming odds, but had actually expanded their defensive perimeter and inflicted heavy casualties on German forces attempting to capture the city. The success of the Tobruk defense was attributed by military analysts to numerous factors, but the role of the football program in maintaining morale, physical fitness, and tactical effectiveness was widely recognized as a crucial element in the Australian achievement. The program had demonstrated that unconventional approaches to military training could produce superior results and that cultural traditions could be valuable military assets. The veterans of Tobruk carried the lessons of their football-based training with them throughout the rest of the war, applying these techniques in campaigns across the Pacific, Europe, and other theaters of operation. Many went on to serve in elite units, where their tactical innovation and fighting spirit continued to make significant contributions to Allied victory. The legacy of the Rats of Tobruk and their football program extended far beyond World War II to influence military thinking and training for generations. The program demonstrated that the most effective military training often came from unexpected sources, and that maintaining cultural identity and morale were essential elements of military effectiveness. The story of how Australian rules football became a weapon of war serves as a reminder that innovation and creativity can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. The Australians who defended Tobruk proved that traditional approaches to military training were not always the most effective, and that the best preparation for combat sometimes came from sources that conventional military thinking would never consider. Today, as military forces around the world continue to search for more effective training methods and ways to maintain morale and effectiveness under extreme conditions, the example of the Tobruk football program remains relevant and inspiring. The program demonstrated that the human spirit, when properly channeled and supported, could overcome seemingly impossible odds and achieve extraordinary results. The next time you watch a game of Australian rules football, remember the soldiers who used that same brutal, beautiful game to forge themselves into one of the most effective fighting forces in military history. Remember that they proved the power of cultural identity, team spirit, and unconventional thinking to overcome any obstacle and achieve victory against impossible odds. The story of the Rats of Tobruk and their football program stands as a testament to the power of human ingenuity and determination to find solutions to the most challenging problems. Their legacy reminds us that the most effective approaches to any challenge often come from unexpected sources, and that maintaining our cultural identity and values can be our greatest strength in times of crisis. Stories like that of the Rats of Tobruk reveal the incredible creativity and resilience that ordinary soldiers displayed when faced with extraordinary challenges during World War II. From Australian footballers in the desert to Polish pilots in the skies over Britain, from Norwegian commandos in the Arctic to French resistance fighters in occupied cities, the war was filled with examples of people who found innovative ways to turn their civilian skills and cultural backgrounds into military advantages. That's exactly what we explore here: the forgotten innovations, the unconventional warriors, and the extraordinary ways that ordinary people found to contribute to the fight for freedom. If you're fascinated by stories of military innovation and cultural resilience, if you want to discover more examples of how creativity and determination can overcome any obstacle, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. The history of warfare is filled with Rats of Tobruk, who proved that the most powerful weapons are often the ones that come from the human spirit, cultural pride, and the refusal to give up in the face of impossible odds.